July 1st, 1924, a bittersweet but historic day in what was then the self-governing Dominion of Newfoundland. Nearly 6 years after the armistice that ended the bloody First World War, and more than 3 years after planning began, the Newfoundland National War Memorial in downtown St. John's is officially dedicated. In a city steeped in history, this was another moment, heavy with emotion and unconditional reverence for the hundreds of Newfoundlanders who died in a global conflict. A famous British general pulled a rope and removed the canvas that covered the elaborate monument.
By every estimate, this was the biggest crowd that ever gathered in Newfoundland for anything up to that point. It was our way of thanking those who had given their lives in the war.
There were 2,500 just in the parade, just various service groups and so on involved in the parade. And 20,000 people hanging off rooftops and out of windows and crowding the streets for the unveiling.
They said there was at least from 3,000 to 5,000 people who could not hear or could not see the memorial, but they were down there anyway. So that shows you, because it was raw in their mind, it was a huge and emotional time.
The bronze and granite monument was created to honor the more than 12,000 Newfoundlanders and Labradorians who served and sacrificed during the First World War. More than 1,700 lost their lives, and roughly 800 of those who died have no known grave. The war was a defining moment in history for Newfoundland, which had a wartime population of around 240,000, less than half of what it is today. The monument was unveiled by Field Marshal Douglas Haig. In that era, he was world famous. Haig commanded the British Army on the Western Front for most of the war, including the 1916 Somme offensive. That battle was one of the deadliest in human history. On July 1st, the Newfoundland Regiment was massacred at Beaumont Hamel. Haig wrote to the governor of Newfoundland just days after the battle. Newfoundland may well feel proud of her sons, whose heroism and devotion to duty displayed on July 1st have never been surpassed. Haig had a soft spot for the Newfoundlanders, and the feeling was mutual. A special poppy campaign was organized to pay for his trip to Newfoundland. Haig was a celebrity, credited for orchestrating victory over the Germans. When he was in St. John's in early July 1924, it was celebrated as Haig Week.
They had a man who was then a virtual superstar, Field Marshal Haig, who was greatly admired by soldiers who served under him during the war, which was a large number of the Newfoundlanders who served. And so you have this moment that everybody knew was going to be a great moment. And so people showed up, and in very large numbers.
We have photos of the crowds crowding St. John's Harbor just trying to get a glimpse of the man. And Haig himself said he wanted to travel very simply. He didn't want any fuss up during his voyage. He just wanted to arrive, and it would be his honor to unveil the monument. He thought that was a really important part of his duty to the people. There was an entire week of him inspecting troops, inspecting Boy Scout groups, Girl Guides, the CLB. He was into everything.
But this was the main focus. Its artistry and design, crafted from bronze and granite, unlike anything ever seen in St. John's. A combination of allegorical and realistic bronze sculptures, designed by British artists Gilbert Bayes and Ferdinand Victor Blunstone. Elevated high atop a central pedestal, a female statue known as the Spirit of Newfoundland. The Victory Statue, a torch in her left hand, a symbol of freedom, inspired by the famous poem In Flanders Fields by John McCrae.
The torch, be yours to hold it high.
A sword poised in her right hand, ready for battle if freedom is threatened again. Lower on the monument, 4 realistic figures represent the different branches in which most served during the war. On the west pedestal, a sailor holding a spyglass, representing those who joined the Royal Naval Reserve. A Royal Newfoundland Regiment soldier is crouched on one knee on the east pedestal, dressed in full battle gear, loading his rifle and searching the horizon for the enemy. At the front of the monument, statues of a fisherman and a logger symbolize those who served with the Merchant Marine and the Newfoundland Forestry Companies. This bronze plaque explains that the memorial was erected by a grateful people to honor its war dead. Similar plaques have been added to commemorate those who died in the Second World War, the Korean War, and the war in Afghanistan. The monument is seated on a granite semicircular dais, rising from the entrance on Water Street to the cenotaph on Duckworth Street. For generations, it's been the focal point of remembrance, designated a National Historic Site in 2019, the only war memorial in Canada to receive such a distinction. But if you're going to tell the story of the Newfoundland National War Memorial in St. John's, you have to start here in northern France. This is the Beaumont-Hamel Newfoundland Memorial, and it was on battlefields like this where the deadly toll of war was exacted, and also ignited such a powerful desire to remember those who served, and especially those who never came home. It was a big moment, and it took a big personality to make it happen. Meet Thomas Nangle. Thomas Nangle was a Catholic priest in St. John's who served as padre to the regiment. He served alongside the soldiers, in the trenches, burying the dead, consoling the wounded, and motivating the troops. After the war, he returned to France and Gallipoli and played a big role in recovering and identifying the remains of Newfoundland soldiers who were killed in battle. He also spearheaded the establishment of 5 caribou memorials in France and Belgium, what came to be known as the Trail of the Caribou, and was called upon in early 1922 to help with the National War Memorial after the effort began to stall.
He knew more than anyone else how important it was for the mothers of those people and all their families. And the feeling was, are we just going to forget them now? And the mothers and the fathers, at home for the rest of their lives, especially the mothers, will take that emptiness and hurt to the grave. They started in 1918 talking about it, but it took until Padre Nangle finally had it finished in 1924. He was the leading person, the energy behind it.
July 1st, 1916. It's the opening day of the Battle of the Somme, and the Newfoundland Regiment is ordered to advance at Beaumont-Hamel. It's the regiment's first major offensive. It ends in tragedy. Nearly 800 men go into battle. In half an hour, more than 700 are either killed, wounded, or missing. Throughout the war, the regiment suffered one of the highest casualty rates of any unit under British command. Of the more than 6,200 men who enlist, 1,305 lose their lives. Another 2,314 are wounded. Nearly every family in Newfoundland was touched by the war, and those who lost a loved one, well, they had to struggle through their grief without saying a proper goodbye. That's because our dead never came home. They were either buried in cemeteries near the battlefield where they fell, or their remains were never found or identified, and they have no known grave. So the emotions on the day of the unveiling of the War Memorial in St. John's are still very raw. Many in attendance are veterans of the Great War, still carrying the scars, both physically and emotionally, of a war that claimed millions of lives. Thousands of families are still in a daze, filled with questions about what happened to their lost sons. For many who enlisted, the war was a path to adventure, a chance to serve king and country. For others, it was a journey out of poverty, and many were signing up at the ages of 16, even 15, lying about their ages.
Everything I could find, Terry, is logged and put into, and I got 2 more binders downstairs.
Gary Brown spent decades researching this era, combing through letters and documents, piecing together the trail of heartbreak left by the war. He wrote a book about Thomas Nangle. He also wrote about the boy soldiers who went to war.
Just put yourself in the shoes of a mother and a father. when a boy left and he was underage, and they sort of felt they let them go, and then all of a sudden they don't come back. They don't know where they're buried. So just think about the emotion of that.
Newfoundland was a self-governing dominion during the First World War, had its own legislature, control over its internal affairs. Britain's oldest colony, on par with other dominions such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. When Britain declared war on Germany in the summer of 1914, the Newfoundland government quickly fell in line and offered to raise an infantry regiment to serve alongside the British. A mere 4 months later, the first contingent of Newfoundlanders, known as the First 500, leave St. John's aboard the SS Florizel. For the next 4 years, Newfoundlanders forge a legacy of service and courage, whether it's in the trenches, at sea, in the forests of Scotland, or on the home front. But it's a legacy that comes at great expense in both blood and treasure. A generation of young men are either killed or disabled, and those who survive physical harm are tormented by the horrors they witness. It was all this grief, loss, heartache, and maybe even some guilt that ignited a movement in Newfoundland, a movement to remember, so war memorials start going up in communities across the land. Some of these memorials pay tribute to a single fallen soldier, like this one in Norris Point, honoring John Major, and larger war memorials like this one in Grand Falls, featuring the names of 55 local residents who died in the First World War. Newfoundland in the 1920s is a challenging place. The government is heavily in debt from building a railroad and the immense cost of supporting Britain's war effort. There's also political turbulence as successive governments are toppled and corruption is exposed, and veterans fight for pension benefits. The post-war period is one of economic stagnation.
And also in January 1921, the price of fish collapsed in overseas markets, which led to a lot of destitution and the requirement for government spending on relief of poverty. So the government didn't have a lot of money to play with.
The government of Newfoundland was not in a position to fund these memorials. But with 800 men missing in action, never returned home, graves unknown, where could everyone go to honor those men?
After war, Newfoundland is desperate to honor its fallen soldiers. That effort begins in earnest in June of 1921. Between 80 and 100 citizens, a who's who of the city's elite, assembles for a meeting.
Those gathered that very first night expressed a bit of embarrassment, disappointment in themselves that they hadn't gotten together sooner to start action on this. So they immediately started formulating a plan, and they had a very ambitious goal of unveiling this in just 13 months' time, July 1st, 1922. That didn't happen.
At this first meeting, there's disagreement. Some want a standalone war memorial, located in a prominent place and worthy of the sacrifices it's meant to symbolize. Some suggest a giant caribou, the emblem of the Newfoundland Regiment, atop Signal Hill. Others lobby for a school to be built in memory of the fallen. There's also debate over a location. 8 possible sites are considered. They eventually decide this is the spot, King's Beach, where Sir Humphrey Gilbert claims Newfoundland for the British Crown in 1583. A steep, rocky incline, a bleak but ideal location on the waterfront. It's close to where the first 500 embarked on the Florizel years earlier and was a welcome landmark for soldiers returning from the war. The project receives a boost when city leaders set aside $5,000 to blast rock from the site. And the Great War Veterans Association ensures that most of those doing the labor are veterans. But all is not well.
There was no money. People were a little bit resentful, even if it was an unspoken resentment of this attempt to raise this much money at a time when people were feeling, definitely an economic pinch. People were destitute, and here they are asking for money to build this huge monument.
The goal of the War Memorial Committee and people like Thomas Nangle is to create a war memorial in St. John's, one that pays tribute to the thousands who unselfishly and courageously ventured into the jaws of a global conflict. But the biggest stumbling block? Cash. So the committee begins a money-raising blitz. There's sporting tournaments and card games. They even offer rides in this airplane, owned by Major Sidney Cotton. And there's this unique fundraiser. The committee incorporates the National War Memorial Company Limited and begins selling $1 shares in the company. These booklets are circulated through Newfoundland and beyond.
He must have decided, well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to send my dollar.
Some donations are very personal and reflect the upheaval the war inflicted on families. Here's Frederick White of Twillingate. Frederick's girlfriend was pregnant when he went off to war, and his son Harvey was born in 1915, 10 months before the regiment's near annihilation at Beaumont Hamel. Frederick White is among those killed in battle and has no known grave. Here's his name on the bronze plaque at the base of the Caribou Monument at the Beaumont Hamel Newfoundland Memorial in northern France. In his hometown in Twillingate, Frederick White is remembered at this cemetery.
He died at his post, like a soldier brave. He has answered his captain's call. He sleeps far away in a hero's grave. For his country's cause, he did fall.
Frederick never saw his son Harvey, but this letter suggests that boy was eager to honor his father's sacrifice.
My grandfather was only a story, a legend, almost. We had a picture of him and his brother hanging in our house, and we had the medal that they sent to families. They called it the death penny.
This letter to Thomas Nangle resurfaced many years ago and found its way back to the White family in Twillingate. It appears to be a typed version of the original letter, is filled with spelling errors, and is signed by Harry White. But Eleanor Manuel believes her father, Harvey White, wrote the original letter.
And I had $1 gave me for keeping head of my class. So I am sending it to you for Beaumont Hamel Memorial. That is the spot where my father was killed July 1st, 1916. I am enclosing $1. Yours very truly, Harvey White, Durrell's Arm, Twillingate.
The letter refers to a memorial at Beaumont Hamel. But is that what the young orphan from Twillingate meant? Beaumont Hamel? Maybe not.
The timing of this letter is just 3 weeks after Nangle becomes involved with the National War Memorial Committee. So there would have been quite a lot of radio coverage. It would have been in the newspapers that Father Nangle was taking this on, whereas he wasn't raising money for the Beaumont Hamel memorials.
The letter is now on display at the Rooms Museum. More than that, it's a family treasure for the descendants of Frederick White and Harvey White.
That must have struck him in some way, that when he earned this $1 for being the head of his class, he decided that's what he wanted to do with it.
By the winter of 1922, the committee has raised $15,000, a substantial figure for that era, but far short of their $50,000 goal. So the plan to unveil the monument in 1922 is shelved. While efforts are running out of steam in St. John's, Thomas Nangle, the regiment's beloved padre, is over here in France and Belgium building war memorials like this one. But he's also needed at home. So Nangle returns to Newfoundland. There's a meeting with the War Memorial Committee. Nangle is side by side with Newfoundland's Prime Minister, Richard Squires, at the meeting. There's a major shakeup. It's a turning point. Squires tells the committee his government will fund a school in honor of the war dead, Memorial University College, later to be called Memorial University of Newfoundland, opens on Parade Street in 1925. And Nangle also delivers some big news to the committee. The Imperial War Graves Commission is pledging £5 sterling for every Newfoundlander who died during the war.
So that would be more than enough to create this war memorial. But he had one condition. He wanted free hand to do this. Let me do whatever it takes to create this memorial, I'll put together a proper committee, and this will be our focus. And we're going to make this happen by July 1st, 1924.
So things are back on track.
Right here, we're looking at some of the original sketches for the War Memorial.
And it's here at the rooms in St. John's where much of the documents connected to that effort can be found. This archivist has been sifting through photos, meeting minutes, contracts, letters and drawings. Gerald Whitty, Robert Rendell, Jack Higgins. These names and others surface repeatedly as people at the forefront of the War Memorial movement.
They spent a lot of time talking about the best plants to use, how the wind would flow through the site, and we're seeing all that sort of sketched in here, where the shrubs would be, the sidewalk, they're looking at snow breaks here, the chain fence along right here, and of course the retaining wall right here, which would be granite with the memorial plaques on it.
But these documents also lay bare some of the controversy and setbacks that nearly derail the effort. One of the biggest feuds involves Thomas Nangle and renowned British sculptor Basil Gatto. The two are well known to each other. Gatto had created the Fighting Newfoundlander statue at Bowring Park. He made the Caribou memorials in France and Belgium, so it made sense that Gatto would also create the statues for the National War Memorial in St. John's. But in 1923, Nangle fires Gatto. The biggest issue? This clay model of a Royal Naval Reserve sailor. He's shirtless, carrying a rifle, not an accurate reflection of the Naval Reserve.
So this was just one of the problems. Nangle writes back and says, well, Gatto doesn't quite seem to be understanding my vision for this monument. I've told him this isn't really what we need. This needs to be replaced with a ramrod or a swab. This can't be a rifle. But here's the model, the clay model, which never does get cast because just a few months later, they fire Basil Gatto. Nangle has reached an end with it. The telegram just says, Gatto is fired.
It wasn't just the model. There was a fight with Gatto over delivery dates and payments.
By the time Gatto was fired, they've gotten much, much lower quotes from other sculptors across Europe. And that's why they move on. They hire Ferdinand Blundstone and Gilbert Bayes to actually create the final sculptures that we see now. So it could have been a very different looking monument.
Many feel a monument would eventually have been completed, but the timeline and design may have been completely different if Nangle did not step up when he did.
I always get the impression that Nangle was a real go-getter. He was a very personable person. He was charming. They say he had the confidence of an athlete. He knew everybody.
I believe he had all this experience and expertise, and he was actually there in the trenches with the boys. He comes home. So what better person could we have found to look after that national memorial and bring it to fruition? You couldn't find a better person.
And it's through Nangle's connections that Rudyard Kipling, the famous English poet and novelist, becomes involved with the project.
Nangle had reached out to the author Rudyard Kipling to create the memorial tablet for Amiens Cathedral in France. And Kipling had happily done that, and he'd written a beautiful inscription that's on the tablet there. So he reached out to him again and said, would you be able to write something for our National War Memorial? And Kipling did that. So that lovely inscription that's on the monument now was written by Rudyard Kipling, author of Captain Courageous and the Jungle Book.
The granite for the monument, meanwhile, comes from quarries in Scotland. And again, Nangle found a unique way to cut costs.
He called everybody who may have an empty ship returning to St. John's Harbor and said, can we ship this as ballast? Can you take some granite? What can you do for me? So all of the granite and the sculptures came in about 6 or 7 different shipments of varying weights. He promised everybody that they would waive the customs fees when they got here. They set a deal with the government to waive the customs fees. So the grand total for bringing all of that granite here was next to nothing in the end.
By today's standards, this would have been a mega project in the early 1920s. No hydraulically operated heavy equipment back in these days. Men with strong backs and leathery hands did all this. Eventually, fundraising targets are met. When the monument is finished, every cent is spent. But this is the result. This memorial was unveiled 15 years before Canada's National War Memorial in Ottawa, and 27 years before Newfoundland became a province of Canada. And now it's about to become a cemetery as well. On July 1st, 100 years later, this will be the tomb of an unknown soldier.
That whole loop is closed when we put that remains down there. Now it becomes a Commonwealth War Graves cemetery, and Nangle's dreams come true. Newfoundland, you've done it right. You have glorified your heroes. You have not glorified war.
The unknown soldier could be any one of hundreds. He could be from any family. He could be Eleanor Manuel's grandfather.
There's something about the tomb of the unknown soldier that brings tears. It brings tears because of the sacrifice they made and the families that were shattered. And, you know, it's a bittersweet honor. I mean, whoever it is, it's still a great honor to have our own provincial unknown soldier.
100 years ago, the memorial was new. A century later, it's shining again, ready for another 100 years of remembrance, carrying on the dream of Thomas Nangle and all the people who built this so long ago.
As loved our Father, so we loved, where once they stood we stand. Their prayers we raise to heaven above. God guard thee, Newfoundland. God guard thee, God guard thee, God guard thee, Newfoundland.